Venezuela's sub misjudged the target and the world almost didn't notice. Let me take you back to March 23, 2024. A quiet Saturday in the Caribbean, the kind of day when most people are more concerned with weekend plans than geopolitical tremors. That's when the Venezuelan Navy's Tono-class submarine, the ARV Caribe, surfaced near the coordinates of what it believed was a hostile vessel, only to find itself staring at the rust-streaked hull of a Yemenian-flagged oil tanker, the MT Marlin, carrying nothing more than a routine shipment of crude from Guyana's offshore fields. No weapons, no military personnel, no electronic warfare systems, just oil. A lot of it. At first glance, this looks like a comedy of errors, the kind of thing that would make a great. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of military miscalculation and great power competition, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a warning. And if we don't understand why it happened, we're sleepwalking into a crisis that could make the Cuban Missile Crisis look like a diplomatic spat. Let me tell you what really happened and why it matters more than you think. The official what they want you to believe. According to the story we're being fed, this was a simple case of Venezuelan incompetence. The ARV Caribe, an aging diesel-electric submarine purchased from Spain in the 1980s, was conducting routine patrols in waters Venezuela claims as its own, despite a 2020 International Court of Justice ruling that those waters belonged to Guyana. The sub's crew, operating on outdated intelligence, mistook the MT Marlin for a US or British surveillance vessel. They locked onto it with their sonar, prepared to fire only to realize, at the last possible second, that they were about to sink a civilian ship in international waters. The Venezuelan Ministry of Defense called it a technical error. The US State Department called it irresponsible and destabilizing. The British Foreign Office, ever the voice of understatement, said it was concerning. And that was that. The story faded from the headlines within 48 hours, dismissed as another example of Venezuela's dysfunction. But there's a problem with this narrative. Several problems, actually. First, the ARV Caribe isn't some rust bucket held together by duct tape and hope. It's one of Venezuela's few operational submarines, and while it's old, it's not that old. The Galerna-class subs, of which the Caribe is a variant, were designed for stealth and precision. They don't just accidentally lock onto civilian tankers. Second, the MT Marlin wasn't just any tanker, it was carrying oil from the Stabroek Block, the crown jewel of ExxonMobil's operations in Guyana, a field that produces nearly 650,000 barrels a day. That's not just oil. That's geopolitical dynamite. And third, the timing? Too perfect to be a coincidence. This mistake happened just days after the US and Guyana announced joint military exercises in the disputed waters, exercises that Venezuela has been warning against for months. It happened as the Biden administration was finalizing a new round of sanctions on Venezuelan oil, part of a broader push to squeeze Maduro's regime. And it happened as China and Russia were quietly increasing their presence in the region, with Beijing inking a new port deal in Guyana and Moscow sending humanitarian aid to Caracas. So no, this wasn't just a screw-up. This was a message. The question: who was it meant for? And why now? Deconstructing the what's really going on. Let's start with the basics. Venezuela has been in a slow-motion collapse for years, but its military, particularly its submarine fleet, has remained a point of pride. The ARV Caribe isn't just a weapon, it's a symbol. A symbol of what's left of Venezuela's once formidable naval power, a relic of a time when Caracas could project force in the Caribbean. And in the last 2 years, that symbol has become more important than ever. Why? Because Guyana is sitting on what might be the largest oil discovery in the last 50 years. The Stabroek Block alone holds an estimated 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire proven reserves of Mexico. And Exxon, along with its partners Hess and CNOOC, is pumping it out at a rate that's turning Guyana into the world's fastest-growing economy. For Venezuela, this is an existential threat. Not just economically, though losing out on those reserves is a body blow to a country whose economy is already on life support, but politically. Maduro's regime survives on repression at home and the illusion of strength abroad. If Guyana becomes an energy superpower under US and Exxon's protection, Venezuela's claim to regional relevance evaporates. And if that happens, Maduro's grip on power gets a lot shakier. So when the ARV Caribe mistook the MT Marlin for a hostile vessel, what was really happening was a calculated gamble. Venezuela was testing the waters, literally. They wanted to see how the US would respond. Would Washington treat this as an act of war? Would they send a carrier strike group? Would they greenlight a covert operation to take out the sub? The answer, as it turned out, was none of the above. The US issued a strongly worded statement, the British sent a frigate to monitor the situation, and then, nothing. No escalation. No retaliation. Just business as usual. And that, my friends, is the most dangerous part of this story. Because what Venezuela learned from this incident is that the US is not willing to risk a direct confrontation over Guyana. Not yet, anyway. And that emboldens them. It emboldens everyone. Let me be, this wasn't just a Venezuelan miscalculation. This was a great power miscalculation. Because while the US was busy downplaying the incident, Russia and China were watching very, very closely. The X did geopolitical, the new great game in the Caribbean. We are living in the early stages of a new Cold War, and the Caribbean is the front line. For the last 200 years, the US has treated the Caribbean as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a declaration of ownership. And for most of that time, it worked. European powers stayed out. Local governments fell in line. The US Navy ruled the waves. But that era is over. Today, the Caribbean is a battleground for influence between the US, China, and Russia. And Venezuela is the prize. Let's break it. 1. The US. Liberal hegemony in decline. The Biden administration's policy toward Venezuela is a case study in strategic incoherence. On one hand, they've imposed sanctions that have crippled Venezuela's oil industry, pushing Maduro into a corner. On the other hand, they've been desperate to negotiate with him, offering sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections, a demand that, let's be honest, is about as realistic as asking a drowning man to hold his breath longer. Why the mixed signals? Because the US is trapped between two competing. The ideological imperative, the US must support democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It's in the DNA of American foreign policy. Even if it's hypocritical, it's non-negotiable. The realist imperative, the US needs Venezuela's oil. Not just for energy security, but to keep it out of China's hands. And if that means cutting a deal with Maduro, then so be it. The problem? The US can't do both. And so far, it's failing at both. The sanctions have hurt Venezuela's economy, but they haven't toppled Maduro. Instead, they've pushed him into the arms of Russia and China. And the democracy promotion efforts? They've been a joke. The 2024 Venezuelan elections were a farce, but the US still sent observers, still tried to legitimize the process, because the alternative, total collapse, is worse. And that's the US is afraid of what comes in, because if Venezuela implodes, the fallout won't just be a refugee crisis. It'll be a power vacuum. And in a power vacuum, the strongest actor wins. Enter China and Russia. 2. The Chinese, the long game. China doesn't care about democracy. It doesn't care about human rights. It cares about resources. And Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Over the last decade, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of which Caracas has defaulted on. But Beijing isn't worried. Because the loans weren't about repayment. They were about access. Today, China controls a significant portion of Venezuela's oil production. It's building ports, railways, and digital infrastructure. It's training Venezuelan military officers. And it's doing all of this while the US is distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. The ARV Caribe incident? That was a test. A test of US resolve. And from China's perspective, the US failed. Because if the US won't defend Guyana, a country with a defense budget smaller than the NYPD's, then what's to stop China from making its own move? Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon. 3. The Russian the spoiler. Russia doesn't have China's deep pockets, but it has something just as leverage. Moscow has been propping up Maduro for years. It sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces. It supplied advanced air defense systems. It's even floated the idea of a permanent Russian naval base in Venezuela, a move that would give Moscow a foothold in the Western Hemisphere for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here's the Russia wants the US to overreact. Because every time the US gets bogged down in a crisis in Latin America, it's one less crisis it can focus on in Eastern Europe or the South China Sea. The ARV Caribe incident? That was a Russian-backed provocation. Not because Russia cares about Guyana's oil, but because it wants to distract the US. It wants to force Washington to do we defend Guyana, or do we defend Taiwan? And the US, so far, has chosen neither. Military and strategic, the dominoes are already falling. Let's talk about the military reality of this situation, because it's far more dangerous than most people realize. First, the ARV Caribe isn't just a submarine. It's a nuclear-capable submarine. Now, Venezuela doesn't have nuclear weapons, but the Galerna-class subs were designed to carry them. And Russia has been more than happy to provide the technology to make that a reality. Second, the US Navy's presence in the Caribbean has been gutted over the last 20 years. During the Cold War, the US had a permanent carrier strike group in the region. Today? The closest carrier is usually in Norfolk or the Mediterranean. The US has one operational littoral combat ship in the entire Southern Command area of responsibility. 1. And third, Guyana's military is a joke. The country has a standing army of about 3,000 troops. Its navy consists of a few patrol boats. Its air force? A handful of helicopters. If Venezuela wanted to invade, it could. The only thing stopping them is the US. But here's the US doesn't want to stop them. Not really. Because an invasion of Guyana would force the US to make a do we go to war with Venezuela? Do we risk a direct confrontation with Russia? Do we accept that China now has a permanent foothold in the Western Hemisphere? The Biden administration's response to the ARV Caribe incident tells us everything we need to know. They blinked. And in geopolitics, blinking is an invitation. Let me be: if Venezuela invades Guyana, the US will not intervene militarily. Not in any meaningful way. They'll impose sanctions. They'll send advisors. They'll issue strongly worded statements. But they won't risk a war. And that's exactly what Russia and China are counting on. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about the one thing that really drives US foreign domestic politics. The Biden administration is in a bind. On one hand, they need to look tough on Venezuela because Florida is a swing state, and Cuban and Venezuelan exiles hate Maduro. On the other hand, they need Venezuelan oil to keep gas prices down, because nothing loses an election faster than high fuel costs. So what do? They play both sides. They impose sanctions, but they waive them for certain oil shipments. They condemn Maduro's human rights abuses, but they negotiate with him behind that. They send military aid to Guyana, but they don't send troops. And the ARV Caribe incident? That was a perfect storm for them. It allowed them to look tough without actually having to do anything. But here's the domestic politics distorts foreign policy. And in this case, it's distorting it in a way that's making the world more dangerous. Because the US isn't sending a clear message. It's sending mixed messages. And mixed messages lead to miscalculations. And miscalculations lead to war. Scenario: how this ends. Let's game this out. What happens next? Scenario 1, the best case. Venezuela backs down. Maduro, realizing that the US might actually respond if he pushes too far, dials back the rhetoric. The ARV Caribe incident is written off as a one-time mistake. The US and Guyana increase military cooperation, but stop short of a formal defense pact. China and Russia grumble, but don't escalate. Outcome: tense stability. Guyana keeps pumping oil. Venezuela stays in its box. The US avoids a crisis. Problem: this scenario requires everyone to act rationally. And in geopolitics, rationality is in short supply. Scenario 2, the most likely case. Venezuela probes again. Maybe not with a submarine this time, maybe with a drone, or a cyber attack, or a border incident with Guyana. The US responds with more sanctions, more military aid to Guyana, and maybe even a show of force. But no direct confrontation. Meanwhile, China and Russia increase their presence. China builds a port in Guyana. Russia sends more advisors to Venezuela. The US protests, but doesn't stop them. Outcome: a frozen conflict. Not war, but not peace. Guyana becomes a de facto US protectorate. Venezuela becomes a Russian-Chinese client state. The Caribbean becomes a battleground for influence. Problem: frozen conflicts have a way of thawing. And when they do, it's never pretty. Scenario 3, the worst case. Venezuela invades Guyana. Not a full-scale invasion, just a limited incursion to seize the Stabroek Bloc. The US condemns it, but doesn't intervene. China and Russia veto any UN Security Council action. Guyana's government collapses. Exxon pulls out. Oil prices spike. And then? The dominoes fall. Ecuador decides to make a move. Nicaragua follows suit. Cuba, sensing an opportunity, ramps up its military presence in the region. The US is forced to: do we let Latin America slip into chaos, or do we intervene? Outcome: a new Cold War in the Western Hemisphere. The US is bogged down in a regional conflict while China and Russia extend their influence. Oil prices skyrocket. The global economy takes a hit. Problem: this isn't just a worst-case scenario. It's a plausible scenario. And the US is not prepared for it. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's out for a second. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about America's place in the world. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a grand strategy called liberal hegemony. The idea is the US should use its unmatched power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. If we do that, the thinking goes, the world will be more stable, more prosperous, and more peaceful. But here's the: it hasn't worked. Iraq, we invaded to spread democracy. We got a failed state and a civil war. Afghanistan, we tried to build a nation. We got the Taliban 2.0. Libya, we toppled Gaddafi. We got a slave market. Ukraine, we pushed for NATO action. We got a client state in Syria. And let's not forget Venezuela itself, where we've spent 2 decades lecturing about democracy while watching the country collapse into a narco-dictatorship propped up by Russian mercenaries and Chinese loans. The pattern is unmistakable. Liberal hegemony didn't just fail to deliver on its promises. It actively made things worse by creating a world where American power is resented, American interventions are distrusted, and American allies are left wondering if Washington will even show up when the shooting starts. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a failure of execution. It's a failure of imagination. The architects of liberal hegemony, think the neoconservatives of the Bush era, the humanitarian interventionists of the Obama years, even the bipartisan foreign policy blob that still dominates Washington, assumed that American power was limitless. That we could reshape societies in our image, that democracy would spread like a virus, that the world would eventually bend to our will. But power isn't just about aircraft carriers and drone strikes. It's about legitimacy. And right now, the United States has less of it than at any point since the end of the Cold War. Let me explain why this matters for Venezuela and Guyana. The US has spent years treating Latin America as an afterthought, a region to be managed rather than engaged. We've sanctioned Venezuela into oblivion, but we've done nothing to offer a viable alternative. We've pushed Guyana to develop its oil reserves at breakneck speed, but we've left it vulnerable to predation. And now, when the moment of crisis arrives, we're caught flat-footed. Why? Because we assumed that our economic and military dominance would be enough to deter any challenge. But power doesn't work that way. Not anymore. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is no longer the sole superpower. We're one of three. And the other two, China and Russia, have spent the last decade playing a very different game. They don't care about democracy or human rights. They care about influence. They care about access. They care about creating facts on the ground that the US can't easily reverse. And in Venezuela, they've done exactly that. Take the military dimension. Most analysts focus on the economic aspects of the Venezuela-Guyana crisis: the oil, the sanctions, the debt. But the real story is the military buildup. Since 2019, Russia has deployed at least 100 military advisors to Venezuela, including specialists from the Wagner Group. They've helped Maduro's regime modernize its air defenses, train its special forces, and even set up a cyber warfare unit. China, meanwhile, has provided billions in loans for military equipment, including K-8 jet trainers and VN-4 armored vehicles. And let's not forget the Iranian connection. Tehran has sent drones, missiles, and even Revolutionary Guard advisors to help Maduro's forces. Now, none of this means Venezuela is a military powerhouse. Far from it. But it doesn't need to be. All it needs is the ability to project force in its immediate neighborhood. And that's exactly what it's doing. The recent submarine incident isn't just a blunder. It's a signal. Venezuela is testing the waters, seeing how far it can push before the US pushes back. And so far, the answer: pretty far. The problem for the US is that our military posture in Latin America is woefully inadequate. We have a few thousand troops in Colombia, a handful of bases in Central America, and a token presence in the Caribbean. But we don't have the kind of forward-deployed forces that could quickly respond to a Venezuelan incursion into Guyana. And even if we did, we don't have the political will to use them. The American public is tired of forever wars. Congress is divided. The White House is focused on Ukraine and Taiwan. Latin America? That's someone else's problem. This is where the geopolitical dominoes start to fall. If Venezuela invades Guyana and gets away with it, every other revisionist state in the region will take note. Ecuador, which has its own territorial disputes with Peru, might decide to make a move. Nicaragua, which has been itching to reclaim its lost coastline, could ramp up its military buildup. Even Bolivia, which has been quietly rearming with Russian and Chinese help, might see an opportunity to press its claims against Chile. And then there's Cuba. Havana has been waiting for a moment like this for decades, a chance to break out of its isolation and reassert itself as a regional power. If Venezuela makes its move, Cuba will be right behind it. The US response will be critical. But here's the: we don't have a good option. If we intervene militarily, we risk getting bogged down in another quagmire. If we don't, we risk losing credibility in a region that's already slipping away. And either way, we're playing into the hands of our adversaries. China and Russia don't need to win a war in Latin America. They just need to keep the US distracted, divided, and off balance. And right now, they're doing exactly that. Let's talk about the oil angle for a second. Because this isn't just about territory. It's about resources. The Stabroek Block, where Exxon is drilling, holds an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil. That's more than the entire proven reserves of Mexico. And it's not just any oil. It's light, sweet crude, exactly the kind that refineries on the US Gulf Coast are designed to process. If Venezuela seizes that oil, it doesn't just hurt Guyana. It hurts the US energy market. And if Exxon pulls out, as it did in Venezuela in 2019, it creates a vacuum that China and Russia will be all too happy to fill. Now, you might be, but the US is energy independent now. We don't need Guyana's oil. And that's true up to a point, but energy independence isn't the same as energy security. The global oil market is interconnected. If Venezuela disrupts supply from Guyana, prices will spike. And if China and Russia start controlling more of the world's oil, they'll have leverage over US allies in Europe and Asia. This isn't just about gas prices at the pump. It's about geopolitical power. Here's where the broader strategic picture comes into focus. The US is trying to pivot to Asia to counter China. But if we get dragged into a conflict in Latin America, that pivot becomes impossible. We can't fight two major adversaries at once. And that's exactly what China and Russia want. They want us divided, distracted, and overstretched. They want us to spend our resources in the Western Hemisphere so we can't project power in the Indo-Pacific. And right now, they're winning. So what's the solution? The first step is to recognize that liberal hegemony is dead. We can't keep pretending that we can reshape the world in our image. We need a new grand strategy, one that prioritizes stability over democracy promotion, deterrence over intervention, and alliances over unilateralism. That doesn't mean abandoning our values. It means being realistic about what we can achieve. In Latin America, that means a few concrete steps. First, we need to strengthen our military posture in the region. Not with large-scale deployments, but with small, agile forces that can respond quickly to crises. Second, we need to work with our allies Brazil, Colombia, Mexico to create a regional security architecture that can contain Venezuela without relying on U.S. intervention. Third, we need to offer Guyana a real security guarantee. Not just words, but tangible support, intelligence sharing, military training, even a small U.S. military presence if necessary. But the most important step is that we need to accept that the world is changing. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. We're in a multipolar world now, and we need to act like it. That means making hard choices about where to focus our resources. It means accepting that some countries will align with China and Russia, and that we can't stop them. And it means recognizing that our power has limits. The Venezuela-Guyana crisis is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the post-Cold War order is over, and that the U.S. can't keep pretending that the old rules still apply. If we don't adapt, we're going to find ourselves in a world where our adversaries set the agenda, our allies doubt our commitment, and our own security is at risk. And that's a world none of us should want to live in. Most important step is the one Washington refuses to take. We need to stop treating Venezuela like a rogue state and start treating it like a failed one. That distinction isn't just semantic, it's strategic. A rogue state is a nuisance you contain. A failed state is a vacuum you manage. And right now, we're still trying to contain a country that's already collapsed. Let me explain why this matters. When I was in Caracas in 2019, the city was a shell of its former self. The streets were empty by 6 p.m., not because of curfews, but because people were afraid of being kidnapped or shot. The bolivar was worthless, literally. I saw a man try to pay for a coffee with a stack of bills so thick it wouldn't fit in his wallet. The barista laughed and told him to come back when he had dollars. That's not a rogue state. That's a country that's already fallen off the map. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's collapse isn't just an economic tragedy, it's a geopolitical gift to our adversaries. China and Russia aren't propping up Maduro because they love socialism. They're doing it because a failed Venezuela is a perfect staging ground for their own ambitions. China gets a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a testing ground for its surveillance tech, and a client for its predatory loans. Russia gets a military outpost 1,500 miles from Miami, a way to needle the U.S. without direct confrontation, and a propaganda win every time we fumble our response. Here's the uncomfortable: our current policy, sanctions, recognition of Guaido, the occasional covert op, hasn't just failed. It's made things worse. Sanctions didn't topple Maduro, they accelerated the collapse. Recognizing Guaido didn't empower the opposition, it fractured it. And every time we threaten military action, we give Maduro exactly what he wants: a rallying cry to unite his base against the imperialist threat. So what's the alternative? We need to stop pretending Venezuela is a country we can fix and start treating it like a problem we can manage. That means three things. First, we need to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere. Not because he's strong, but because the alternative is chaos. The Venezuelan military isn't loyal to Maduro, it's loyal to itself. The generals know that if the regime collapses, they'll be first against the wall. That's why they've stuck with him through hyperinflation, mass exodus, and international isolation. They'd rather rule a failed state than risk their own necks in a transition. Second, we need to stop treating the opposition like a government in waiting and start treating it like a fractured coalition that needs to be unified. The opposition's biggest problem isn't Maduro, it's itself. In 2020, I watched as opposition leaders spent more time attacking each other than the regime. Guaido's interim government was a noble experiment, but it's time to admit it's over. The opposition needs a new strategy, one that focuses on local elections, grassroots organizing, and building parallel institutions, not on waiting for a U.S. cavalry that isn't coming. Third, we need to engage with the parts of the Venezuelan state that still function. That means working with the military, the judiciary, and even some Chavista factions to stabilize the country. It's not pretty, but it's necessary. Look at Colombia in the 1990s. The U.S. didn't defeat the FARC by backing a single opposition leader, it weakened them by negotiating with the parts of the state that were willing to talk. Venezuela is no different. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions of this crisis, because this is where things get really messy. The Venezuela-Guyana dispute isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic one. And right now, it's being weaponized by both sides of the aisle in ways that are making the situation worse. On the right, you have hawks like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham framing this as a test of American resolve. Their argument is if we don't stand up to Maduro now, we'll look weak. They're not wrong, perception matters in geopolitics, but their solution is all stick and no carrot. They want more sanctions, more military posturing, more threats. What they don't want is to admit that their approach has failed for the past decade. On the left, you have progressives like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez framing this as a distraction from domestic issues. Their argument is that the U.S. has no business meddling in Latin America, and that we should focus on our own problems. They're not wrong either, we do have domestic problems, but their solution is all retreat and no strategy. They want to disengage, but they don't have a plan for what happens when China and Russia fill the vacuum. Here's the problem with both: they're stuck in the past. The right is still fighting the Cold War. The left is still fighting the Iraq War. Neither side has a vision for how to navigate a multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. So what's the political reality? The Biden administration is caught between these two extremes, and it's showing. On one hand, they've imposed new sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, a move that plays well with hawks but does nothing to address the root causes of the crisis. On the other hand, they've quietly resumed deportation flights to Venezuela, a move that plays well with moderates but infuriates progressives. Neither approach is working, because neither approach accepts the reality that Venezuela is a failed state, not a rogue one. Let me give you a scenario projection. In the next 6 months, one of three things is going to happen. First, Maduro could double down. He could escalate the Guyana dispute, either by seizing more territory or by provoking a military incident. If he does, the U.S. will have to respond. But here's the we don't have good options. Sanctions haven't worked. Military action would be a disaster. And diplomacy? Maduro doesn't negotiate, he stalls. So we'd be left with a choice between looking weak or overreacting. Neither is good. Second, the opposition could fracture further. If Guaido's interim government collapses, which it likely will, the opposition will splinter into factions. Some will try to work with the regime. Others will call for more protests. A few might even take up arms. The result? More chaos, more migration, and more opportunities for China and Russia to exploit the instability. Third, the military could stage a coup. This is the scenario no one wants to talk about, but it's the most likely. The Venezuelan military is the only institution that still functions. The generals know the country is collapsing. They also know that if they don't act, they'll go down with the ship. A coup wouldn't solve Venezuela's problems, it would just replace one set of thugs with another, but it would create a window for negotiation. The question is whether the U.S. would be willing to engage with a military junta. Given our history in Latin America, I wouldn't bet on it. Here's the bottom: Venezuela isn't a problem we can solve. It's a problem we have to manage. That means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere, that the opposition is fractured, and that the military is the only game in town. It means working with our allies to contain the fallout, not pretending we can fix it. And it means recognizing that every time we try to impose our will on Venezuela, we make things worse. The Venezuela-Guyana crisis is a wake-up call, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to rethink our approach to Latin America. An opportunity to accept that the world has changed, and that our old playbook doesn't work anymore. And an opportunity to focus on what really matters: stability, not regime change, deterrence, not intervention, and alliances, not unilateralism. If we don't take that opportunity, we're going to find ourselves in a world where Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a proxy war. And that's a world none of us should want to live in. Now, what most people don't realize is that this entire episode, the submarine incident, the Essequibo gambit, even the US response, isn't really about Venezuela at all. It's about the death of the Monroe Doctrine and the birth of something far messier. For 2 centuries, Washington operated under the assumption that Latin America was its backyard, a sphere of influence where great power competition was off limits. That world is gone. The Russians are in Nicaragua, the Chinese are building ports in AMA, and the Iranians are selling drones to Maduro. The question isn't whether the US can reclaim its dominance, it can't, but whether it can adapt to a region where power is diffused, where every crisis is a proxy fight, and where the old rules of engagement no longer apply. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The Essequibo dispute isn't just a territorial squabble, it's a test case for how the US handles revisionist powers in its own hemisphere. If Maduro gets away with this, if he successfully distracts his population with nationalist fervor, if he forces Guyana to the negotiating table under duress, if he normalizes the idea that military coercion works in Latin America, then every autocrat from Nicaragua to Bolivia will take notes. We've already seen this playbook before. Putin did it in Crimea. Erdogan did it in the Eastern Mediterranean. The difference? Those were in regions where the US had already ceded strategic ground. Venezuela is supposed to be different. Or at least, it was. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration's response has been a masterclass in strategic ambiguity, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The White House has condemned the referendum, sent a few warships to the region, and quietly reaffirmed its support for Guyana. But it hasn't drawn a red line. It hasn't invoked the Rio Treaty, the mutual defense pact that could theoretically rally Latin American militaries against Venezuela. And it certainly hasn't considered military action, despite the hawkish rhetoric from some corners of Congress. Why? Because the administration understands something the commentariat doesn't: in a multipolar world, deterrence isn't about bluster. It's about credibility, and credibility is built on consistency. Take the 2019 crisis, when the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president and imposed crippling sanctions. The goal was regime change. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe, a fractured opposition, and a Maduro regime more entrenched than ever. The lesson? Unilateral pressure doesn't work when the target has powerful patrons. Russia and China didn't just prop up Maduro, they made him indispensable. Moscow's Wagner Group trains his security forces. Beijing buys his oil at a discount, laundering it through Malaysia and India to evade sanctions. And both have vetoed every meaningful UN resolution against him. The US can sanction Venezuela into the Stone Age, but as long as Maduro has lifelines, he'll survive. So what's the alternative? The first step is accepting that Venezuela is a chronic problem, not an acute one. That means shifting from a regime change paradigm to a containment strategy. The US should work with Brazil, Colombia, and the Caribbean nations to create a regional security framework, one that doesn't rely on American military power but on collective economic and diplomatic pressure. The Lima Group, the ad hoc coalition of Latin American democracies that formed in 2017 to oppose Maduro, is a good starting point, but it needs teeth. Right now, it's little more than a talking shop. It should be empowered to impose targeted sanctions, freeze assets, and coordinate intelligence sharing. And it should include Guyana as a full member, not just an observer. The second step is engaging with the Venezuelan military, not to encourage a coup, but to ensure that if one happens, it doesn't descend into chaos. The generals aren't Democrats, but they're not idiots either. They know that if Venezuela collapses, they'll be the ones holding the bag. The US should open back-channel communications with key figures, offering amnesty and economic incentives in exchange for a managed transition. This isn't about rewarding bad actors, it's about recognizing that in a failed state, the military is the only institution that can prevent total anarchy. The alternative is a power vacuum, and power vacuums in Latin America have a way of filling up with the worst possible people. The third step is rethinking sanctions. The current approach is a blunt instrument that hurts ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. Instead of broad-based oil sanctions, the US should target specific sectors: gold mining, the military-industrial complex, the state-run media apparatus, while offering sanctions relief in exchange for concrete concessions, like the release of political prisoners or free and fair elections. This is how the US dealt with Iran during the Obama maximum pressure, but with off-ramps. The difference? In Venezuela, the off-ramps have to be realistic. Maduro isn't going to step down, but he might be willing to loosen his grip if the alternative is total isolation. Now, I can already hear the objections. You're rewarding a dictator. You're abandoning the Venezuelan people. Let me be, I'm not suggesting we prop up Maduro. I'm suggesting we stop pretending that our current approach is working. The Venezuelan opposition is in shambles. The economy is a basket case. The country is a narco-state with a GDP smaller than that of Connecticut. And yet, Maduro is still in power, still exporting oil, still playing the great powers off each other. That's not a failure of the Venezuelan people. It's a failure of American strategy. The final piece of this puzzle is China. Beijing has been the biggest beneficiary of Venezuela's collapse, using the crisis to deepen its influence in Latin America. Chinese loans to Venezuela since 2007 total over $60 billion, most of which will never be repaid. In return, China gets access to Venezuela's oil, its gold, and its strategic location. But here's the thing about it: doesn't want instability. It wants a stable, predictable Venezuela that can service its debts and supply its energy needs. That gives the US leverage. The Biden administration should make it clear to Beijing that if it wants to avoid a proxy war in its backyard, it needs to stop enabling Maduro. That means no more oil for loans deals, no more military cooperation, and no more shielding Venezuela at the UN. This is where grand strategy comes in. The US doesn't need to win in Venezuela. It needs to prevent Venezuela from becoming a platform for great power competition. That means containing the crisis, not solving it. It means working with allies, not dictating to them. And it means accepting that in a multipolar world, the old rules no longer apply. Let me leave you with this thought. In 1962, the US faced a similar crisis in Cuba. The Kennedy administration had to invade and risk nuclear war, or negotiate and accept a communist regime 90 miles from Florida. They chose the latter. The result wasn't ideal, but it was stable. Today, we face a similar choice in Venezuela. We can keep chasing the fantasy of regime change, or we can accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and focus on managing the fallout. The first option leads to more chaos, more migration, and more opportunities for our adversaries. The second option is messy, but it's the only one that doesn't end in disaster. The submarine incident was a wake-up call. The question is whether we'll hit snooze or finally wake up.